the biggest bee I've ever seen just flew into my window. It was like a bullet. Hello, today I'm here to talk to you about books that put me in a bad place, books that filled me with darkness, depressing literature. I have 4 of them here with me right now, and there's 3 other ones that I'm also going to talk about. If you read any of these, proceed with caution. I mean, the title of the video really says it all. These books are sad, and they deal with really heavy topics. I'm not going to get into detail about that in the video, but just be warned. The first book I have is a memoir. This is Something Fierce by Carmen Aguirre. First cute story about this book. I found this at a thrift store. Okay. Growing up, I spent a lot of time on this really small island that has like 300 residents called Saturna. And Saturna has a very, very small library in the basement of the one church that's there. I found this at a thrift store on Vancouver Island, which is, to be honest, not that far away, but it's not the same place. And it's from that library. I spent so much time in that library growing up. Saturna is just like such a special place in my heart. I was so thrilled when I found this. But thrilled is not the emotion I would say I felt while reading this. This is a memoir about a woman who grows up as part of the resistance movement against the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile in the 1970s and 80s. Her parents were university professors in Chile who favored the socialist government, and they were exiled from their country once the coup happened. They end up setting up a safe house in Bolivia where revolutionaries come and go, and it's this very tense and dangerous life that she's living. It's so repressed and lonely being part of this really, really secret thing. Like from the age of 12, she is living this underground double life, and she really can't grow up as a normal girl. She can't get close to anyone outside of her immediate family, and she's also often really scared for the safety of that family. Her parents will go on like missions, and she doesn't know when or even if they will ever come back. She grows up, and when she turns 18, she ends up becoming a member of the resistance movement, and she just really lives this profoundly traumatic life in the name of what she believes in. Everything in her life, everything in her family's life revolve around this revolution. And then it dissolves. And that's the end of the book, is that it kind of just was all for nothing. It ends on this very hopeless note. You spend a book reading about how much she has given up for this movement, and it goes nowhere. It does nothing. It's heartbreaking. I really did learn so much reading this book about the histories and cultures of like multiple countries in South America. She lives in Peru, Argentina, Bolivia, and then of course you learn a lot about Chile. So it's like very educational in a way, but God, it hurts when you flip that last page. It's so heavy. The next book is The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. This is a fiction novel about a new mother who just has a really bad day, and it ends in her daughter being removed from her care. She's sent to a year-long court-ordered remedial institution that's meant to teach her how to raise a child properly, and it's the only way, like if she has to pass this to get her daughter back. She's in there with a ton of other women, all typically poor women of color who have also had their children removed from their care. And these women are all in classes together, classes that are meant to teach them how to care for their children, how to bathe them, how to feed them, how to respond to their big emotions. But the goals in these classes are so unachievable and unfair, and the stakes are so high because this is the only way to get her daughter back, and she has to reach these like absolutely impossible goals to do that. It's about state surveillance and the scrutiny that mothers are under, and systemic discrimination, and just the injustices of the child protection system. And there's this absolutely prevailing sense of injustice through the whole thing that is so immobilizing. The book can be a little bit slow and repetitive, and so you're frustrated with what's happening to her and also kind of with reading it, and it makes you feel so out of control and very much in the head of the character. And it just sucks. It sucks to follow a character who works so hard and it just can't pay off no matter what she does. Next is We Both Laughed in Pleasure by Sullivan. This is the life of maybe the first publicly, openly gay trans man told in his own words. It's a collection of his diaries. And they start from when he was like 12 in the 60s up to his death at almost 40 in the 90s. This is largely about his gender and sexuality in a very rapidly shifting social and political landscape. It's him figuring out that trans is something that he can be. And a lot of it is the joy he experiences in his gender transition and finding his community. This is diary entries, so it does feel a little bit voyeuristic when you're reading it. Like, it's a bit uncomfy, especially because it is very sexual. Sullivan was a slut in the most warm way possible. Lovingly, Sullivan was a slut. So it is a relief to know. He writes at the end that this was his intention. He was collecting these diaries because he wanted them to be published like this, but still, like, it sometimes feels a bit icky reading it. Ultimately, this becomes a story of a man who's dying from AIDS when he is way too young. There's this one line that's such a gut punch, but it also just perfectly encapsulates like the kind of person that he is. He writes that he took a certain pleasure in telling the gender clinic clinic that even though their program told him that he could not live as a gay man, he was going to die like one. Though the last quarter of this book really is about his decline in health and sort of watching him deteriorate, this is definitely the most hopeful and bright book of all of these. Lou Sullivan has such a singular voice, and he's just kind of this beacon. And in a world where most trans stories are super fucking depressing, it's kind of wonderful to know that in the end, overall, his was a joyous one, even though it does end in his death, and it's heartbreaking. Next is another fiction book. This is The Water Cure by Sophie Mackintosh. And I didn't really like this book. I'm not really recommending this book. I just want to talk about it, get it out of my head. It does fit the theme. It filled me with darkness in a very icky way. I really didn't like it. I really did not like reading it. I was really uncomfortable the entire time. This is about 3 sisters who live isolated on this island with their father and mother. Their father is a kind of cult leader guy who is telling them a lot of what you think are lies, but you never really know. It could be dystopian. I don't think it is. I don't think you're supposed to trust the father. He's a very unreliable character. He's telling them that the outside world is very unsafe, and he makes them do these really weird and abusive and sometimes violent treatments and rituals to stave off the never-ending threat from the outside. And hugely, he teaches them to fear men. He says, all men are dangerous except me. I'm the good one. I'm not like other guys. And very early on in this book, this man who controls their entire lives disappears, and he doesn't come back. But 3 other men, strangers from the outside, wash up on the shore of their island. It's a shifting perspective, but it mainly follows the middle sister, Leah, who is discovering her sexuality and breaking away from the conditioning that she has been stuck in for her entire life and falling in love with one of these men. The thing is that Leah feels like a child. She's written like a child. She's meant to feel like a child. She has lived this super isolated life, and she's only ever known herself in the position of daughter, and so it makes sense that she would be very childlike in the way that she acts and thinks about the world and makes sense of the people around her. But it also means that it feels like you're reading a story about a child falling in love with a grown man who she has just met and is much more experienced than her, who is taking advantage of her. And that's icky, particularly because this is not making some greater commentary on it. This is not really saying anything. The blurb, very, in my opinion, disingenuously and disgracefully, calls this a feminist revenge fantasy, which is almost offensive. Because not only is this kind of gross feeling because of her childlike mannerisms, it also reduces the mom to the role of mother. Never in this book does it feel like any of these 4 women get to take the power back. Where's the revenge? Where's the revenge fantasy? What are you fucking talking about? I just felt like I needed to shower when I finished this book. It made me feel really gross and kind of sick to my stomach. Next we have Taking the Rap by Anne Hansen, and I apologize for the cover of this. It had this layer of thin plastic on top of it, almost like tape, that you could just peel off, and it left all these white marks all over the place, but I couldn't stop myself. Is there any on this side I could do? I could show you. Okay, are you ready? You get why I was doing that, right? Anyway, Taking the Rap. This is kind of a deep cut. This has I think 3 reviews on Goodreads, and that is because it's really specific to the place that I live in. Not so specific that it will mean nothing to you if you're from somewhere else, but this is super duper set in Canada, particularly BC. And part of it particularly is set in my hometown. This is a memoir about a member of a radical anarchist group called the Squamish Five, which Squamish is my hometown, which is, I think, why I picked this up. I actually think my mom gave this to me. I think my mom gave this to me. She told me this book made her an abolitionist, and I was like, fuck yeah. This group protested through bombings. They bombed some makers of American missiles. They bombed, I think, the Ministry of Environmental Protection. They threw Molotov cocktails at a adult video store that was selling some incredibly illegal content. And after a year of doing this radical shit, they're caught and arrested. And the woman who wrote this book, Anne Hansen, is sent to prison. And this memoir is mostly about the time that Anne Hansen spends in the Canadian prison system and the injustice and oppression and dehumanization that occurs in there. After what feels like an eternity in this monotonous hellhole where she is not treated like a human, and many of the women around her, she's a white woman, many of the women around her are treated much worse, she's released. And then a very small, inconsequential mistake sends her back to prison. It's devastating. That's fucking devastating. I was reacting out loud reading this. I my tummy hurt. I did not want her to go back to prison. She has a relationship with a woman while she's on the inside, and it ends in maybe the most tragic way I've ever seen in my life. I had to put the book down and walk away from it because it was so sad. And that image is really the main thing that I remember about this book. It is incredibly unforgettable because of how fucking devastating it is. I wouldn't say this ends in an incredibly depressing way. Anne Hansen is still kicking around being a rad as fuck anarchist, like standing by her beliefs. It's depressing because this is about prisons in like 30 or 40 years ago, and nothing has changed. And the conditions are so terrible back then, and they are essentially the exact same now, and that just sucks. People have been wanting change for so long, and it's so stagnant. Like, we're just so stuck in this punitive punishment approach. It feels like we'll never move away from it. And that is hopeless and super depressing. Up next is Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv. This is one of the only hardcover copies that I own of any book because it was the only one at the bookstore. I fucking hate hard copies. I hate a dust cover. The only reason this dust cover is on is because I'm talking to you about it and I wanted to show you the cover, but I don't even want to touch it. Ugh. This is a nonfiction book that follows a collection of people and their experiences with mental illness. And this is not your like kind of conventional middle of the road anxiety and depression, which definitely has a place in literature. I think such a massive space has been made for those stories, and this tells the stories of mental illnesses that are definitely underrepresented, very stigmatized, and it's incredibly empathetic in its portrayal of them, while also exploring the intersection of race and culture and identity. It starts with her talking about her own eating disorder that she was diagnosed with at the age of like 6, and she's institutionalized for it at that time. And it's a very unique story. And she also talks about the story of a woman who is treated alongside her at the time, who's a bit older than her, and that's mainly told through her diary entries and I think conversations with her mom. And that story has a deeply heartbreaking and again unforgettable ending. It's just like created such a clear and horrific mental image in my mind that I don't think I'll ever forget. There's also a woman in here who's recovering from an episode of psychosis in the hospital, and she's trying to reach some sort of forgiveness from her children. And then there's a woman who goes off her meds because she has been medicated for so long she doesn't know who she is without these medications. It's all very personal and very intimate, but it hit very close to home for me. I just remember being really sad when I finished this book and feeling like I wanted to throw a bit of a pity party for myself. If you're like a well-adjusted adult, this is probably just like interesting. It is a really good book. It's told really well. But if you are someone who like really fucking struggles, this might be a hard read. It was for me. Okay. Finally, we have Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. I'm not sure if I can talk about it, to be honest. When I was writing down my thoughts in preparation for this video, I was tearing up. I consider this to be my #1 book of all time. I have never felt more feelings than I did while reading this book. It was so much. Literally like crying so hard I was hiccuping and like gagging like a kid at points in this story. I don't know how I survived reading this book. I love it. I love it. Whoa. Stone Butch Blues is about Jess Goldberg, who is a kind of gender nonconforming butch lesbian who ends up transitioning into a man and then later on detransitioning. This book is just so lonely. Jess is such a lonely character. It is so hard to find anyone to connect to. There's this part in the like way in the beginning when she's at school and her teacher gives them like an assignment. She's so ostracized at school. Her teacher gives them an assignment to find like the first 8 lines of a poem. And Jess reads the first 8 lines of Alone by Edgar Allan Poe, which I have memorized because of this book. It goes, "From childhood's hour I have not been, as others were, I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone." Like chills, actual chills. The point in the book that she reads this is so fucking moving. Like, I can't even talk about it. Like, I actually can't even talk about it. We need to move on. She grows up so lonely and so alienated, and then she finds her community, and the community takes her in, and she just keeps losing that community and finding it again and losing it and finding it again. So much happens to her. It is like recalling it back, it almost feels like trauma porn, but none of it happens just like for the shock factor or just happens just to happen. It all makes a lot of sense, but like, goddamn, is there a lot of trauma in this book. Everyone dies. Her house burns down. She is beaten and assaulted by everyone in every way, at every level. The police encounters that she has, it just hurts to be inside the mind of this deeply lonely and vulnerable character who wants nothing more than connection and love, but just cannot get close to people, can't open up to them, and like ruins so many relationships because of it. It's so raw. This is required queer reading, but please like genuinely be in a good place when you read this, because I actually almost killed myself. Like I truly, like, I do not know how I survived this shit. It does end on a hopeful note, but no ending could erase the horrific experiences that Jess has gone through. And so it's hopeful in a way, but whoa, this sat heavy on my chest. This is still sitting heavy on my chest. I read it like 2 years ago. You have to read this book, but take care of yourself, please. Okay, that's all I have for you. Be nice to yourself if you read any of these, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.